It's been a while since I've talked about Lupin the Third, and even longer since I've done a retro anime review, so today we're going to change that. For this installment of my retro anime review, I'll be taking a look at Lupin the Third Part 2. If you're unfamiliar with my retro anime reviews, I watch an older retro anime, usually it's for the first time, but not always. I then in the video go over the history and production of the anime. Sometimes I touch on the anime's place in pop culture and what other series have been influenced by it. I also share my general thoughts on the series, breaking down some episodes or aspects of the anime I liked, but also touching on some episodes and aspects I didn't like. It's a bit of everything. Without further ado, let's start this retro anime review for Lupin the Third Part 2. Lupin the Third Part 2, for a lot of people I imagine, is quintessential Lupin the Third, especially out of the TV series entries. For many, it may have been their first foray into the Lupin the Third series. For me, it's come much later. I've seen most of the modern Lupin the Third entries from around 2011 onward. My perspective is that I'm fairly familiar with Lupin the Third, its characters, and how the series is structured, but I'm experiencing a lot of the older Lupin the Third entries for the first time. Essentially, I'm coming in with a bit more modern perspective. I should also mention, I've really only ever watched Lupin the Third with the original Japanese audio, so potentially keep all that in mind for later when I share my thoughts on the anime. However, first, let's start with a little history. Lupin the Third Part 2 came about after reruns of Lupin the Third Part 1 did well in TV ratings. It began airing on October 3rd, 1977 and ran until October 6th, 1980, consisting of 155 episodes. However, at the time, it wasn't called Lupin the Third Part 2. It was just Lupin the Third, just like how Part 1 was called Lupin the Third back when it aired. Part 2 was originally given the nickname Shin Lupin III to help differentiate it from the previous Lupin anime series. Shin Lupin III also mirrored the manga title New Lupin III, a sequel to the original Lupin III manga. While most of the world now knows the Lupin III TV entries as Lupin III Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, so on and so forth, Part 1 and Part 2 were retrospectively added later, everywhere except for Japan and Italy, where the entries in the anime are titled Lupin the Third First Series and Lupin the Third Second Series. Though it should be noted, TMS Entertainment, who produces and manages the Lupin the Third series, has of late been using the Part 2 branding more in Japan. Focusing on the Lupin the Third Part 2 anime itself, it ran almost non-stop for 3 years, and there was a lot of different people who came in to work on the production. Some notable ones include Atsushi Yamatoya, who was a writer on Part 1, but also a director of a number of risque films, who came in to oversee series composition starting with episode 53. The character designer and animation director was Takio Kitahara. He would go on to work on various City Hunter entries, though towards the end of Part 2, things got a little interesting regarding animation and character designs that involved a couple of familiar faces in the anime industry. If you recall from my Lupin the Third Part 1 retro anime review, Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata were brought in by Yasuya Otsuka to essentially help right the ship, after Part 1 initially had poor ratings. Afterward, Miyazaki would eventually transfer to Telecom Animation Film, an affiliate of Tokyo Movie, who would have Miyazaki direct the second feature film for Lupin the Third, Lupin the Third, The Castle of Cagliostro. Miyazaki would also direct 2 episodes here in Lupin the Third Part 2, but more on them later. Yasuo Otsuka would eventually join Miyazaki at Telecom to help train animators, as Telecom had been subcontracted to work on the animation for Part 2. Otsuka would become more involved starting with episode 72, and produced character designs that were more in line with the castle of Cagliostro, that Takeo Kitahara would constantly have to correct. This continued until episode 105, where he finally gave up trying to have the animation follow his character designs. It's very noticeable while watching part 2 that the character designs change. It's a bit of a mixed bag, but weirdly adds to the charm of this anime. Another one of the charms of this anime is the music. The music in part 2 was composed by Yuji Ono, who, barring a few exceptions, has continued to compose the music for Lupin the Third to this day. Yuji Ono gave the Lupin the Third series a more consistent jazz sound in the music, and of course, composed the iconic Lupin the Third opening theme, still used to this day with new arrangements. I definitely don't think it's a stretch to say that the Lupin the Third series found its sound during part 2, but not just with the music. If you're familiar with the original Japanese audio, part 2 was when the series solidified the main cast for quite a while. Yasuo Yamada, Kiyoshi Kobayashi, and Goro Naya would reprise their roles from part 1 as Lupin, Jigen, and Zenigata. Makio Inoue would take over the role of Goemon, and Eiko Masuyama would return to voice Fujiko, who she had originally portrayed in the Lupin the Third pilot film, alongside Kobayashi and Naya. The five would work together on Lupin the Third until Yasuo Yamada's death in 1995. His last completed role was Lupin the Third, Dragon of Doom, the only exception being Lupin the Third, The Fuma Conspiracy, where they didn't bring back any of the main cast for that OVA in order to keep production costs down. This, however, is a video on Lupin the Third Part 2, so let's shift gears a little and focus on the anime proper, as well as my thoughts on it. Lupin the Third Part 2 was set 5 years after the events of Part 1. It would also tend to follow the comedic and more family-friendly tone that was introduced in Part 1 after Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata started working on that anime. Touching on my personal viewing experience, it took me a while to get through this anime. I started watching Part 2 a week or two after Lupin the Third Part 6 finished airing, and I only recently finished it. It was a mix of trying to find the time to watch it, but also not burn myself out on Lupin the Third. I generally enjoy Lupin the Third, and I didn't want to make watching it feel like a chore. We also had 2 Lupin the Third anime entries come out in between Part 6 and now, Lupin Zero and Lupin the Third vs. Cat's Eye, which I did do reviews on, so feel free to check those out if you haven't done so already. I had taken a bit of a break from watching Part 2 in preparation for those anime, and admittedly, it took me a while to get back into watching it, but I'm glad I was finally able to finish it. Like most Lupin the Third anime, Part 2 has a lot of episodic or bottled episodes. There's some continuous continuity, but very rarely at the forefront. When you have a series that is mostly bottled episodes, you can have some amazing one-off episodes. However, you can end up with episodes that are easily forgotten, or episodes that maybe should be forgotten. Focusing on specific episodes, I'm going to touch on a few of the episodes I wasn't too keen on or had problems with, do a rundown of some notable mentions, highlighting some interesting bits, good or bad, before then going over my favorite episodes, which has sort of ended up as my top 5 favorite episodes from Lupin the Third Part 2. Also, apologies in advance if the title names of the episodes aren't what you're used to. I've tried to be somewhat consistent, but the episode titles ended up being a mix of Crunchyrolls and discotheques. Starting with episodes I didn't really care for, episode 26, To Be or Not to Be, which is episode 3 in the Japanese release and is titled Hitler's Legacy. My issue with this episode, besides some obvious stuff, is that it has a weak punchline that takes too long to get to. The punchline at the end of this episode is that Hitler's legacy turns out to be bad report cards and a terrible self-portrait. It's at least taking a jab at one of the worst to ever walk this earth, However, not only is it overshadowed a bit by Lupin and Fujiko being let down that this wasn't some type of treasure, it all kind of gets undone when the self-portrait is thrown into the water and it transitions to a more accurate depiction of Hitler that then winks at the viewer. Completely unnecessary, and it makes it seem that Hitler pulled one over on Lupin, which is ridiculous. This is a bad episode, probably the worst thing I've watched in all of Lupin III. I also wasn't a big fan of episode 144, Fujiko's Close Call Rescue Mission. My issues are with the story and a couple of odd characters. It's a basic damsel in distress episode with Fujiko, which for sure nowadays is an outdated trope to use with her character, but even the very next episode, episode 145, has a better twist on that trope. More on that episode later. This episode also has two weird characters named Nanja and Monja. There's very little introduction to them, they're very easily able to be a match for Lupin, and in general, were kind of annoying. Not an episode I'll rewatch anytime soon. Going over some things I found interesting either one way or another, I want to first touch on the opening and endings. Lupin III Part 2 had 4 different openings and endings over the course of its run. As I mentioned earlier with Yuji Ono, the opening theme would become one of the defining sounds of Lupin III. But as far as animations and what's happening in those openings, I liked how the first opening is action-oriented. I like the color palette and style of the second opening. Furthermore, I like a lot of the animation that is in the third opening, and while the fourth opening is my least favorite in terms of what it's doing with the animation, it does have my favorite version of the theme song from Part 2. Touching on the endings, I find the second ending is the overall better version of the first ending. They are pretty much the same, but the second ending has a better style, and I think the better version of the song. The first ending uses the instrumental version of the song titled Love Theme from Lupin III, while the second ending uses the vocal version. I like the song Love Squall in the third ending, as well as the tone it sets with Fujiko, and in the fourth ending, again I like the song, this one titled Love is Everything, but the animation doesn't do much for me, but it has a decent style. Speaking of songs, during my retro anime review for Part 1, I discussed my dislike for the reoccurring insert song titled Nice Guy Lupin, which described Lupin in the most generic way possible. Part 2 also features a reoccurring insert song, this one titled Superhero. Not only is it a much better sounding song, but if you think of it as being sung from the perspective of Lupin, it makes a lot of sense. Comparing himself to a superhero, that he described himself as smart and cool, handsome, wealthy, and so sexy, Superhero is just such a better insert song for Lupin III than Nice Guy Lupin.
Smart and cool, handsome, wealthy, and so sexy.
Moving on to some episodes I want to touch on. Episode 101, Fervent Love at Versailles, featuring a crossover I wasn't expecting with the Rose of Versailles, also known as Lady Oscar. I watched the Rose of Versailles anime a couple of years ago now, and I overall enjoyed it. It's a historical drama set before and during the French Revolution. It doesn't make a ton of sense on how Lupin and Oscar meet based off the time period each series is set, but it was nice to see Oscar again. Episode 133, Don't Steal the Hot Treasure, featured Claudia, an undercover FBI agent. Honestly, wouldn't mind seeing her character again. If they reintroduced her in a newer Lupin entry, I think that would be pretty cool. Episode 147, The Mermaid That Disappeared in the Midnight Sun, featured an insane train heist. Lupin III has had its fair share of train heists, but this one was pretty over the top. It was ridiculous, but fun to watch. And the last episode I'll touch on before delving into my favorites is episode 149, titled Mecha's Treasure Wore a Veil. First, I like the twist in this episode that the princess turns out to be Fujiko in disguise. However, it turns kind of dark when it's revealed Fujiko was being paid by America, England, Japan, and France to essentially trick Lupin into stealing the oil from the city of Mecca, destroying their oil production and defacing a cultural treasure in the process. Kind of messed up when you think about it. Focusing instead on some positive aspects, going over some of my favorite episodes. I've narrowed it down to 5 episodes, but I won't be ranking them in order. Instead, I'll be going over them in episode order, though I will point out my top favorite episode when I get to it. Up first is episode 95, titled From the Ghost Ship with Love. To start, I like the lighting and shadows the first part of this episode has. Lupin and Fujiko steal a statue called the Stone Child and later get stranded in the Bermuda Triangle. It's an episode that seemingly starts off a bit supernatural before clearing things up, but by the end comes full circle and goes full aliens. The scene at Stonehenge looks really cool. It's a story concept that can be crazy or far-fetched, but I don't mind when the Lupin the Third series butts up against more supernatural aspects. Moving along, episode 112, Danger Goemon. This episode leans a bit darker and has some more mature themes than most Part 2 episodes. It deals with Goemon getting kidnapped and tortured by a pair of assassins named Rose and Wolf, who want to know Lupin's weakness. There are some really cinematic scenes in this episode, but this episode does have a weird tone balance. You have Goemon who is being tortured, while Lupin is being comedic and upbeat. But I really like the scene where the two finally meet up. The brief exchange they have, and then later after Goemon deals with the assassins, Lupin carrying Goemon on his back and joking with Jigen. It was a weirdly wholesome ending after such a dark episode, and I think shows how close the three really are to each other. Up next, episode 137, Teamwork. Some pretty good animation in this episode. However, what I really enjoyed about this episode was not just Lupin, Jigen, Goemon, and Fujiko working together, but that they also had to prepare and practice all their specific parts of the heist. I really like seeing that. It's practice that makes perfect, and seeing that practice makes it more believable why these four are so good at what they do. Part 6 probably isn't many people's favorite Lupin entry, but my favorite episode from that part was when they had to practice for a heist and really work together. It's definitely something I wouldn't mind seeing more of in future Lupin the Third entries, showing the characters prepare and practice for a heist. Overall, I really enjoyed this episode. Coming to a pretty popular one, I imagine, episode 145, Wings of Death, Albatross, and one out of the 2 episodes that were directed by Hayao Miyazaki. The animation in this episode is amazing. The animation and story itself could easily be fit for a movie. The episode deals with a flying bomb factory that Lupin is trying to stop and save Fujiko in the process, who I think is fantastic in this episode. Yeah, Fujiko gets captured and ultimately still needs a little help from Lupin, but it really showcased how capable she is alone when in a pinch. It was really nice to see, and a good twist on the damsel in distress trope, where the damsel sort of is the distress, at least for the baddies this episode. Also, the end of the episode, with Lupin kissing Fujiko on the cheek, was really cute. Lupin can come across a bit pervy at times, but that was the perfect amount of affection to display at that time. It's an amazing episode, and my favorite from Part 2. And finally, to round out my favorite episodes, it's the final episode of Lupin the Third Part 2, and the other episode directed by Hayao Miyazaki, episode 155, Farewell, O Dearest Lupin. Again, animation and story that are movie quality. The episode seemingly has Lupin using an armored flying robot to commit robberies, piloted by a woman named Maki. However, not all is how it seems. I admit, I was a bit bamboozled by this episode. I was pleasantly surprised at how active and competent Zenigata was being, but was a bit disappointed to find out it was Lupin in disguise the entire time. It's not bad, it's something Lupin has done before and continues to do. I just really bought into that Zenigata. Maki was a compelling character, and the fake Lupin, Jigen, and Goemon eventually get their comeuppance. The end of this episode has a nice farewell and send-off for the main characters, and I really enjoyed it, but just fell short of being my favorite, only because Wings of Death Albatross was so good. I really enjoyed Lupin the Third Part 2. I think it has some of the best Lupin the Third that I've watched, but a couple of the worst as well. It has some of the highest highs, but a couple of the lowest lows. For many though, this is quintessential Lupin the Third. Its popularity in Japan is why most TV specials and movies feature Lupin in his red jacket. It might take some time to get through, but if you got into the Lupin the Third series with the modern entries like I did, I very much think watching Part 2 is worth the effort. Keep in mind there are a few low spots, but when Lupin the Third Part 2 is good, it's really good. With all that said, what are your thoughts on Lupin the Third Part 2? And if there are any episodes that you like that I didn't mention, feel free to let me know in the comments. There's a good chance I like them, but this video was more about the history and as a general review of Lupin the Third Part 2 rather than a full recap. So again, let me know your favorite episodes down in the comments. As always, I've been Anime Visor. Thanks for watching, and see you later. Bye bye.